Hello, everyone, and welcome to this penultimate session of Geneva Trade Week. We have a special treat for law academics and fans of all things incredibly wonky in the best possible way today, with our guest speaker, Professor Gregory Shaffer, whose praises I will sing in just a moment. My name is Dmitry Grozbinski, and if you're not tired of me yet, you haven't been watching enough Geneva Trade Week. I am the executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and I also have the privilege of moderating in the loosest sense possible this seminar. Professor Gregory Shaffer is really brought here with us today because he has recently released a new book, which is called Emerging Powers and the World Trading System, the Past and the Future of International Economic Law, which is both a grand title, but somehow manages to also undersell exactly what he did. And that's really how he went about writing this book is the subject of today's lecture, which I think is really important for any researchers and academics contemplating their own journeys into writing things for international trade law. Professor Shaffer is the president-elect of the American International Law Society. I hope I've gotten that right. He recently gave a talk, I think today, on the I suppose the substance of the text or the key findings of the text at the WTO Public Forum, and their technical blessing. Hopefully, it is or soon will be viewable background if you want to find out kind of what the book said. But today we welcome Professor Shaffer to talk about the really unique methodology. And in doing that, let me maybe say, as someone who managed to get an early copy and did some beach reading of this book, what Professor Shaffer did is basically laid out and tracked the evolution of the international legal order in Brazil, China, and India. I have been in this space for quite a while. My inability to grow a beard disguises quite how long. And I had never read anything that attempted the scale and scope of what Professor Shaffer does in this book when it comes to countries outside of, frankly, the European Union and the US, and maybe to a lesser extent, Japan. And today's session is all about the unique way that Professor Shaffer, who is external to these three countries, went about putting this exceptional book together and the unique research methodology he developed to do that. So with far too much preamble already done and the link to Professor Shaffer's book in the chat, let me hand over to him with our thanks and our welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Dmitry. I really appreciate those warm words. I'm going to use a PowerPoint. I'll just say a few words in advance. I guess first, the PowerPoint, I'm going to speak a lot about the methodology of the book, but I'm going to introduce the substance at the beginning as well as the theory, because methods are important, are linked to what you're substantively trying to address or trying to show or trying to research. And methods are also important in theory building. And all methods, of course, have limits. They have pros and cons, but they're useful depending on the type of theory that you're trying to build and the type of questions that you're asking. The other thing I wanted to say is that I was supposed to be in Geneva, but the Delta variant has interfered with that possibility. And so stay safe. My son was vaccinated 5 months ago, and he got COVID this past week. And he's 30 in his 30s. So stay safe. I mainly say this because it was really nice is to be able to speak with people, researchers about their projects and about the challenges they incur. So I really would like this to be a dynamic involving questions and answers. And so I really encourage your questions. So now I'm going to share my screen with this presentation. Let's see. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. 1 second. Sorry about that. And I think it's because it was in this particular mode, it wants to, let's see, we're gonna go back. There we go. Okay, now I'm gonna share my screen and come back on, sorry, for this real quick. So share screen. Why is that wanting to do this? It never does this. I teach and use my screen every week. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So we're live. So here's, I'm gonna put it on presentation mode now. Sorry about that. Okay. Let's see.
If you go on the bottom of the screen, you can also put it in presentation mode.
Yeah, that's
Read to
funny.
the right.
Right here?
That one, slideshow. That's the one.
Okay. But let's see. I have two screens. So so we don't want that. And show. My apologies. Let's see. There. How's that?
Perfect.
That's perfect. Okay. So so first of all, what lies at the core of this book? I mean, that's the book right there. I'm very proud of the cover. And that's where we are as the world trading system today. The paradox, the book at the center of it is a paradox, which is how do sort of national and international processes interact in such a way that to help try to explain why the United States, which was central to the creation of the international trading system, this dispute settlement system, the U.S. primacy back from U.S. victory after World War II and U.S. victory after the Cold War, explaining both the rise of the creation of the GATT and then the creation of the WTO. What was it that that has led the United States to become disenchanted with the WTO and its dispute settlement system and now neutered it, and to bringing us into the world that we've been in since? I mean, it was brewing, but with President Trump, it manifested itself. And so all social sciences, going back, John Eikenberry, this is a famous book, Liberal Leviathan, says that what the U.S. did after the Cold War is it created new rules which could almost be viewed as a global constitution in which it could preserve its power and rule through rules. His central question was, what do states that have just won major wars do with their newly acquired powers? His answer was a legal one. They create the rules of the game. In this situation, he wrote, states have sought to hold on to that power and make it last through institutionalizing it. He called the order that the United States created a liberal hegemonic order because other states consented to it in the context of American unipolar power, while the United States agreed to constrain itself under the rules to make it acceptable. Others, institutionalist Michael Zern, talks about how global governance systems, they're embedded in the normative and institutional structures that contains hierarchies and power inequalities. He thus contends that counter-institutionalization is a preferred strategy by rising powers. Realist Graham Allison, in his book Destined for War, writes, Americans urge other powers to accept a rules-based international order, but through Chinese eyes, this appears to be an order in which Americans make the rules and others obey the rules. To turn from political science to sociology, Pierre Bourdieu in his field theory finds that change within a field occurs through struggles where challengers employ subversion strategies to undermine the legitimacy of the status quo, and dominant groups deploy conservation strategies. The paradox with the trade legal order is that although Brazil and India initially resisted and complained about the WTO's institutionalized legal order, they, along with China, became its defenders, while the United States under the Trump administration finds that change attacked it as illegitimate and neutered its dispute settlement system. So what explains this? What's interesting to this in terms of methodology is the book's genesis. I started researching this, asking the question, how could developing countries build legal capacity to defend themselves, given how much legal firepower existed both within the US government and the European Commission, who had scores of lawyers. They still say they did not have enough, but they had many. And as well, the major law firms who would be representing private US and European clients and working in what, in my first book, Defending Interests, I call public-private partnerships. If the US and Europe could use law to prevail in dispute settlement and shape the rules of the game through legal interpretation, what did this mean for developing countries? Where when you went to Geneva, they would have maybe one lawyer who had to represent the country before all WTO committees, and were just seemed as if they were overwhelmed. In fact, early interviews with African members say, I know nothing about the WTO. I've been here 1 month. I just flew in from Moscow. You tell me what I should know. So how can developing countries, was the initial question, build legal capacity, which I define as the ability of a country through harnessing resources to use law to defend and advance its international, domestic trade and trade implicated policies. I first created a survey with Mark Bush and Eric Reinhardt, which was published in 2009 in the World Trade Review. And I mentioned this in terms of methodology because it was quantitative. And I simply didn't have those types of quantitative skills. So I worked with 2 political scientists who specialized in quantitative work on trade. We got a major grant from the National Science Foundation to create a survey instrument where we tried to measure, created an index for countries' legal capacity, and then check that against who brought claims before the WTO, as well as who faced anti-dumping duties in the United States and what sort of duties did they face. And we found that a country's legal capacity meant at least as much as its economic size and power in explaining outcomes, so that legal capacity mattered. The index captured things like experience, continuity of representation, institutional specialization, assistance from the private sector. So from there, so just to say a little bit about trade law capacity, I don't know if it's only lawyers in the audience, but it clearly it has analogs described in other disciplines. It represents a form of capital or power to advance interests in a contested legal field, that of trade law. It has equivalents for political science as a form of power, and for economists as an incentive-driven investment. The theory behind the book, behind this new book, is part of a series of works that I have, which look at international law, not just as a separate sphere between states hovering above the states, but actually a process of norm making, and through which it's involving processes through which legal norms are constructed, flow, settle, and unsettled transnationally across levels of social organization. So this book and the method was to go into China, India, and Brazil and assess what sort of broader implications did their joining the WTO have for them, especially in each case after they faced major, very controversial legal disputes brought by the United States and Europe against them. And they suddenly realized that the WTO was serious. They needed to develop the internal capacity to defend themselves. And then after they did that, later they developed legal capacity to bring major cases against the United States and Europe, which the book addresses. The results of these processes can give rise to one or more transnational legal orders, which refers to legal norms and associated organizations and actors that order the understanding and practice of law across national jurisdictions. You can think about investment law, intellectual property law, customs law, how to engage in sanitary and phytosanitary standard making, and so forth. Import relief law, all these countries created new institutions, new specializations, new professions, and so forth, unlike the United States and Europe, where this was already very much settled. So you can think broadly about state change in these countries in terms of not only changes in formal national law. China changed over 3,000 laws and regulations after it joined the WTO. But ultimately, I'm interested in law and action. What sort of professions developed? How did the government create new institutions? How did intellectual property law develop? How did local dispute settlement and local courts take place? Changes in the boundary of the state and the market. What's the relative role of the state, the market, and other forms of ordering? This is a picture, by the way, of Itamaraty, the beautiful building in Brasilia, in which Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs is located. Changes in the allocation of authority among state institutions, the relative power of the central government versus states, the role of the trade ministry versus other ministries, the role of the intellectual property ministry, and so forth. Changes in expertise, professionals investing in new forms of expertise to pursue their own careers, and the role of expertise. Changes in associational patterns, institutionalized through mechanisms of accountability and their accompanying normative frames. And this then plays out within local contexts, national contexts. So to turn to the methodology of the book, it's a multi-method qualitative approach involving these 3 extended case studies of Brazil, India, and China in relation to the trade system. It's longitudinal because it took over, I wrote a series of articles and addressed these issues over time. And it's cross-sectional because these 3 countries, even though both are major regional powers, are quite different in their systems of government, their legal cultures, the traditions of the private sector and trade associations, and so forth. Involved over 200 interviews, elite interviews. And these included from the people who at the WTO, from the Director General to Deputy Director Generals to members of the Secretariat across different divisions, members of the appellate body, panelists, and so forth. It included the lawyers both within these countries and in the United States and Europe who represented them or who represented clients who were affected by their domestic measures. It involved, and I'll talk about this a little bit, participant observation, review of primary and secondary materials. Dimitri mentioned that I'm from the United States, and so how does one engage? How does one basically get access within the national capitals in China, Brazil, and India? And what I did, just as where I worked with political scientists when I did a quantitative study, I worked with academics from Brazil, Michel Raton Sanchez Badin, India, James Nadumpra, and China, Henry Gao, and did joint trips with them. And so especially for many of the interviews, it was through their introductions that created a sense of comfort. Because each of these 3 academics were very plugged into these trade networks in these countries, trade and investment networks. And so we'll talk about the initial, so how did the initial interview questions go in terms of, my goal was in the interview to create a sense of rapport, a sense of curiosity, a sense of real interest in what were the challenges and the opportunities that this WTO system posed for the particular people who I was interviewing, be they in the public sector or the private sector. My aim was to obtain their general perspectives without being steered by my questions. I wanted the interviewee to be in the position of teaching me what the challenges were and what had been and could be done over time. I wanted to see the challenges from their eyes. So the conversation was open and informal. My aim was to develop rapport, to understand them. And often the best information I received was their description and explanation of events and experiences recently encountered. Because of the inside knowledge that I built, I was able to gain confidence in discussing the challenges faced and the strategies used in comparative perspective and over time. Now, of course, I've been doing this for a long time, and so I also come with a great deal of expertise and knowledge, and that's an advantage. But I think one really needs to invest in that sort of expertise. And in doing this, especially when one does it systematically, you learn inside information about how the system is working, where you would keep that confidential. But it means that in the interviews, you save a lot of time by sort of getting to the point. They get a sense that they're not teaching you from scratch, rather, but that you also are interested in trying to understand these challenges that they face, and you can compare and contrast sort of what you've heard generally and test it out against them where they can agree, disagree, and so forth. Now, I came to each interview with a set of prepared questions so that I could test these questions across different countries to see how their answers were similar or how they differ. And also, even within the same country, to see with individuals coming from different perspectives or different positions, how their answers were similar or different. And one thing you note when you engage in this type of interviewing is that not everybody, including within government, agrees within these countries. You have, and they can be quite open about it once they gain your trust and a sense of confidentiality of the positioning that takes place. So I tailored the questions, of course, to their specific position and the flow of the interview, but I tried to cover them in each interview. So just to give an example, just on the government side, for government officials, I would ask how the bureaucracy was structured. I would do some advanced research, so I had a good sense of it. The number of lawyers committed to the WTO and other trade dispute settlement, how that changed over time. Interagency processes, their interactions with agencies that might be potentially or actually violating WTO rules, how they could provide assistance to those agencies when those agencies were trying to tailor their regulations and so forth. And where those agencies were challenged, bringing them to Geneva and gathering the information for these types of cases. The relation of the Geneva mission to the capital. This is a major issue for many developing countries where the Geneva mission had long felt simply abandoned and overwhelmed in Geneva, whereas the US and Europe, especially the Commission, could just fly people down for meetings and so forth much more frequently, giving them much more support. The difficulty of retaining expertise, just to give an example for Indian bureaucrats, because of the federalist nature of the country, diplomats then have to, after they've been stationed abroad, have to go back home after so many years to work in a particular Indian region province where they have close knowledge in order to assure that the central government of India also has its people back at home. And so, but that obviously creates a real problem of retaining expertise. So how did they manage that? And how has this changed over time? I asked how they gathered information, developed negotiating proposals, developed cases, worked with private lawyers and affected businesses. I asked about forming negotiating coalitions and strategies. Clearly in Cancun, for example, there's the major coalition between India and Brazil on agricultural negotiations, which aim to counter a joint US-EU proposal, and was a very important moment in WTO negotiating history. China then joined with them, as did other countries, forming what was at the time called the G20. Domestic input processes where they get information, external pressures in trade negotiations, and so forth. External pressures mean the leverage that would be exercised. I was actually in Brasilia at the time that the Trump administration imposed the aluminum and steel tariffs, interviewing someone who actually had to address this and said, you know, it's like negotiating with a gun to your head. Will we accept this? And if we don't accept their proposal, the sanctions will be much worse. The tariffs will be much higher. In some ways, this could be viewed as what's often, which is referred to in the theoretical literature on methodology as a para-ethnography. Sally Mary is recently deceased, engaged in some really fascinating human rights and women's rights work, where she looked at on-site in local countries to see how they translated and hybridized international human rights norms. So in order to advance their goals in local jurisdictions. At the same time, she also went to the global sites, the major fora in which the norms were discussed and elaborated. The idea of para-ethnography comes out of George Marcus. He's actually a colleague of mine here at UCI. He's developed it over time, especially in sort of for these elite cultures, such as at the WTO, highly educated, or central banks, highly professional people who have to make decisions in real time under situations of great uncertainty. So so these individuals are also trying to understand the broader picture that they face in trying to develop immediate responses to immediate challenges. And so para-ethnography entails the study of social processes through elite interviewing, and even working with practitioners who are themselves engaged in what, this is a quote from Marcus, quasi-social scientific studies of the same processes. They are trying to understand what's going on and to respond to this. And so the interviews in part can be viewed as collaborations in the sense, not in the sense of trying to help them, but in the sense of forays into making sense of what's taking place in the trade world. Notice this is a very different view of sort of ethnography as sort of just this neutral outside observer. It's one which is actively trying to discover what's going on, discover what different responses are available. Participant observation. I did some back with ICTSD. It had many dialogues. We organized. I worked with ICTSD to create their dialogues in each region of the world. We had them in Brazil, we had them in China, we had them in Indonesia, and so forth. And we would bring developing country ambassadors and practitioners, the private sector, civil society to these dialogues. And the aim was to try to build legal capacity to engage with the system effectively. I stayed at the WTO during a sabbatical in the research division, which enabled me to attend some meetings and, of course, easily have lunch, drinks, coffee, meet with people. And I also went to Geneva at least once a year. So the interviewees I would meet over time, including both when they were at home and when they were in Geneva as their careers evolved. These country collaborators, even more than me. So James Nadumbra now heads a think tank in the Ministry of Commerce in India, although he also is an outside academic. So he has access to sort of the active sort of development of strategies within India. Henry Gao was very networked into sort of there's a whole sort of WeChat forum where Chinese, duke it out over what China's position should be in different contexts. And so he knew the members of Department of Commerce very well and so forth, were friends. And Michelle Sanchez Badin, who's at FGV in Sao Paulo, Brazil. She's worked frequently in sort of these public-private partnerships as an academic specialist, bringing together Brazilian government officials and the private sector. And so the mark, finally, for me, of a successful interview, I have an article with Victoria Nourse called Empiricism, Experimentalism, and Conditional Theory. It addresses the advantages and limitations of quantitative empirical work, sort of more experimental type work, and in order to build conditional theory. How does theory relate to particular contexts and periods of time? And so we developed the concept of emergent analytics. You see this also in an article that's coming out, it's now online, by Anthea Roberts in the investment realm, of sort of embedding oneself in such a way that one actively is discovering things so that when assumptions are overturned, but there's not only learning in terms of the interviewer, me, but also the interviewee. That's the mark of a very successful interview, that the interviewer is completely engaged. So some findings real quickly: there's a greater professionalization of the trade bureaucracy. There was greater coordination, careers developed. These trade ministries, as people know, they're Janus-faced in the sense that they're both looking outside to see about compliance that affects the trading interests of these countries, but they're also looking inside to protect their own countries from claims. And consequently, you see processes, including in India, Brazil, where draft regulations are sent to the Ministry of Commerce or its analog in the country for their review before they go into effect. You see changes in academia. The first moot court in China was on international trade law. This was used by the Chinese government and the private bar, major law firms, to recruit top associates, new officials. You saw a greater role of lawyers in trade and the private bar, which became more active, which meant that the government had more eyes on what was going on in the world, because the private lawyers were representing private sector. Private sector, you have the growth of trade associations. Even in China, where the government always controlled trade associations, you had the creation of new sort of very sector-specific or product-specific trade associations. You saw development of new think tanks, more sort of tightly linked to the government in India, totally developed by the private sector, such as agribusiness in Brazil. And together, then they created networks, what I can refer to as public-private partnerships, and regarding negotiations, monitoring, and dispute settlement, the three core functions of the WTO. There's clearly some variation in these countries. They had common attributes of being regional powers. They are significantly different cases in terms of a large range of other characteristics, though. So just to give some examples, bureaucratic divisions. Early on, Brazil is always known for top bureaucrats, incredibly competitive, and that was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But Brazil also then moved this into other trade-related ministries, where they hired large number of peoples with who then actually came to the WTO. Some of them are now in the ministry in Beijing, for example, but showing sort of this development of a culture of expertise. You have different legal cultures. Clearly, in China, this is a more recent development, but you see now, major law firms and big skyscrapers. In Brazil, just to give an example of how it differed from China, the Brazilian legal bar actually sued the government to try to force it to include Brazilian law firms in all cases, when initially the Brazilian government was hiring U.S. law firms. You'd never see this happen in China. In India, the government hired the law firms instead of the private sector hiring the law firms. So very different in terms of sort of government control of cases. Trade associations. Brazil early on historically had very well-funded trade associations. And these trade associations, such as what lay behind the cotton and the sugar cases, they actually funded the lawyers to bring these very complicated cases, which were very important in affecting not only agricultural regulation in Europe and nudging it, pushing it in a direction to involve major shifts, but also in the United States, which in addition paid huge amount of damages, compensation to Brazil and its agricultural sector, subsidizing, in a sense, Brazilian agriculture along with U.S. agriculture. You have made differences in think tanks. Again, I mentioned, be they government controlled or private sector controlled. You have differences in language. Obviously, for India, English was easier than it is for China. The major challenges early on for China, a language which they've mastered. And so the differences in how public-private partnerships operated. In any methodology, you're going to have challenges of bias. Of course, in this type of methodology of interviewing, you're worried about simply bringing, leading questions, interviewees confirming what you're already trying to show, and so forth. And so you need to cross-check. You need to interview those with very different interests to see where there's consistency, complementary, contradiction, tensions, and so forth. And then, if you can, go back and see if you get a similar story. One challenge which I note in an extended preface in the book on methodology is that one tends to negotiate to interview the people involved in trade, which, of course, just to give one example, in China, it's not the strongest part of the government, right? So there are other parts of the government who are just much more difficult to reach. And so you're getting sort of that aspect of the government, you're learning about it secondhand. You may learn, complaints about that side of the government, but its power, and people can be very upfront about that. But that's a limitation. You try to complement this with quantitative work where you can. And the advantage of this, as I said, is you learn. You're open to, and it's involved. It's actually, for me, quite fascinating because you're always discovering new things. And of course, it's totally unique, this type of methodology and the types of interviews in which you're engaged. So the book goes from the micro to the macro in the sense that it's a sustained socio-legal approach. The aim is to provide the most thorough, empirically grounded analysis of Brazil's, India's, and China's development of trade law capacity and the implications both within these countries and for the changing ecology of the trade and broader economic legal order. From such ethnographic microanalysis, it provides a unique view of the processes that gave rise to the extraordinary macro-structural development in which the United States now calls into question the very trade law regime it built. It raises broader inferences regarding the role of legal capacity in transnational legal ordering generally, which involves the interaction of states, business, civil society, and international institutions, be it international economic law, investment law, be it human rights law, other areas of law. As a qualitative study, it aims to generate further theorizing regarding the role of law and legal capacity and assessments of state capacity, state institutional change, state-society relations, economic and political development, and the international order itself. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. I really look forward now to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Professor Shaffer. I think I'm about to be, yes, there I am. I'm about to be back on the screen. Now, I know we've asked you all to put your questions in the Q&A box, but uniquely, I think, because when you approached us, Professor Shaffer, you suggested you wanted something that feels a lot more like a seminar than a webinar. We are going to, with your permission, take the risk and allow people to speak if they want to, and we will just take the risk that someone has decided to sit through a 40-minute lecture on the structure or on approaches to international law research in order to yell obscenities at us. We will roll the dice on that and put our faith in our audience. So if anyone wants to ask Professor Shaffer a question, including, and I think this is something that Professor Shaffer said to me when he first reached out, talk about your own research or places that you want to go and ask for advice, for his advice on how to make it better. Please do either raise your hand in chat, pop a question in Q&A. Oh, here we go. We have a question from Vandana, and I will read it to you. Thank you very much, Professor Shaffer, for this important work. Thank you to GTP, CTI, and us for organizing the event. The question is this. The main objective of the book is to understand the development of WTO legal capacity as it has emerged over time, subject to varied and subjective conditions of the three countries, China, India, and Brazil. What are the key lessons for developing countries who are to develop a more sophisticated legal capacity to participate at the multilateral or regional levels in international economic law? And in your understanding, how has such a process informed the transnational legal order? I hope I did that justice.
Yeah. So a two-part question. One is, what are the strategies that other developing countries should apply? And then two, how might that shape the transnational legal order? So on the first, I actually have a book on developing countries with Ricardo Melendez back when ICTSD existed. It's on international trade dispute settlement, the developing country experience. And you can see from this as well, a couple of really key takeaways. One is, the government simply needs to have some basic expertise, but it can't simply rely on centralizing all this expertise in the state. Actually, paradoxically, you strengthen the state through diffusing expertise outside of the state. And that's what all three of these countries did. So you see a lot of trade expertise in all three countries outside of the state. In some cases, you see individuals revolving in and out of the state, as you do in the United States. You see that in Brazil. You don't see that in India, and you don't see that so much in China, although you see some of that in China. And so that's a real takeaway, how to diffuse expertise, how to strengthen the state through diffusing expertise. The second, clearly for many developing countries, is, especially as they get smaller, is how to pool resources, how to create alliances. This could involve, India actually has created a think tank, which is the goal of it is for the broader South Asian region. Of course, India has its own purposes for doing that, one can imagine. But there's engaging in these networks, right, where one has a sense of one's own interests. That's quite important. And so you see these developments. I mean, Trade Lab that Yost has organized, is involved. It's one way of addressing this. There's many. Another would be the ACWL, the Advisory Center on WTO Law, which was created. But even it, when I've long been in touch with ACWL, and they've always said that it's really important to have local expertise, because all they can do is do the technical sort of present the dish, right, at the WTO. But they don't have they don't go inside countries so much, right, in terms of trying to develop the internal regulations or thwart domestic protectionist pressures when the government faces them. They can't come to you with a case, right? You have to come to them with a case. And so you need to work with outside the government with, affected stakeholders in order to develop claims. And examples in terms of the impact, one impact would be simply, joining coalitions in furthering proactively positions. And this is not easy to do, but one of the major developments in Cancun was, for the first time, Brazil and India came up with complex modalities for negotiations, and they had very different interests, obviously, Brazil and India, one being a major export, agribusiness powerhouse, and the other being very protective given the number of self-subsistent agricultural individuals within India. But they came up with new modalities, and they worked with economists, they worked with the private sector, they worked with think tanks domestically, and they joined forces. There's examples of developing countries just on an ad hoc basis also being very successful. So, for example, Bangladesh was the first least developed country to bring a case. It brought one against India, and India withdrew the measure that was being challenged, right? It took a lot of, speaking to Bangladesh officials. This is a case involving battery exports. It took, there were certainly divisions about whether or not they should do this. Could they face retaliation and so forth? But they did it. They were successful. And of course, besides just an ad hoc case, it also let India know that Bangladesh had the resources to use WTO law where it was affecting their stakeholders, where Indian measures were affecting their stakeholders. So that was important. Yeah.
Thank you. Question. That's a really good, I think, a really comprehensive answer. As you were speaking, I forgot to mention, this is in some ways an ICTSD reunion. You yourself have a history there. I work there, and the person currently who has in fact made all of this happen, our events coordinator, is Juanita Kalabala, who did events for ICTSD. So just about everyone is ICTSD alum, which is lovely. So we have a question by email from someone watching on YouTube, and we have a kind of a related question from Julieta Zelikovic. So I might ask those two questions together, and then the email question as a follow-up. So Julieta asks, Julieta is about to start interviewing Latin American diplomats who work on WTO issues. And she asks, what would your advice be in gaining contact with different national delegations? What mistakes to avoid? And then relatedly, the question by email from Ayadona Ayub, part of it was, in your experience, what would be the best time or year, month to speak to Geneva officials? I can tell you immediately it is not August, when absolutely no one is in this city. But I'll leave the rest of the answer to you. Yeah.
So yeah, the first question in terms of how to make first contacts and what mistakes to avoid. I think that when I first started, I did first start as a very young academic. I had introductions by a very well-known professor, Robert Hudek, to members of the WTO Secretariat. And that was incredibly helpful, just to be able to write to them and say, Professor Hudek or Bob Hudek said, suggested I reach out to you. I sent an email, and I'm going to be in Geneva. Would there be a time to come to your office and so forth? And the first piece that I did was all on sort of the trade environment negotiations. And what I learned was there are very different perspectives. Of course, there's a North-South division in the WTO between India, Brazil, US, Europe. But I interviewed civil society organizations, and it was quite interesting that they frame trade and environment issues. They prioritize certain trade environment issues over others in different ways. Right, so that was a form of discovery. I thought of the trade environment issues basically from a US-European perspective until I went and talked with people. But having those interviews was great. I think that's one. And if you have a good interview, they can suggest at the end of the interview, I often ask, well, who else should I talk to? And they will give you other names. That's called snowballing. One interview leads to other interviews. So that's one. Two is you're going to learn a lot. The first interview in some ways is the most difficult because your learning curve is the steepest. After you've already interviewed one or two people, you have sort of an inside thread, which then gives you credentials in terms of you're not starting from scratch with an interview. So you might want to interview someone who you think would more likely be friendly the first time. And there are many people. Interesting. I think two things you should take into account. One is some people just simply are not interviewed that frequently, and they actually it feels good that what they're doing actually is relevant. Someone's interested in what they're doing. They take the time to explain what they're doing. Of course, you want to come in with really knowing your questions and having a good sense of the play of the field, so it doesn't sound like they're just wasting their time, because time is limited. But if you do that, there is a sense that among many that they would like to be helpful. Not all. Some will be, very arrogant, and you'll realize quickly where an interview is going to go nowhere and is a waste of your time as well as their time, and you'll move on. But you'll also find that very sympathetic people who are very interested in your questions and willing to engage, and then that'll build over time. Oh, and as in terms of Geneva, I mean, I think that's right. Obviously, if there's major negotiations going on, obviously it's not the best time. So if you're trying to conclude fisheries negotiations, it's not a good time. But there's often, especially with the WTO these days, many periods of time where they have time on their hands, and including in these capitals. I mean, they can find a half an hour for you. As I mentioned, Brazil was under incredible threat, but the person still found time. And it was quite fascinating, right, to talk to them right at that moment.
Thank you. I think there's a couple of things I'd maybe just add from our own experience. Firstly, that you can actually just reach out to us if you're specifically interested in talking to some delegations, us being Geneva Trade Platform, Center for Trade and Economic Integration. It's our job to know people, and we may be able to help it in some cases, though no promises, of course. We have another, I think, very good question, which from an anonymous attendee, which asks about your experience in China. The question says, when you conduct interviews in China, do you think the Chinese government officials are forthcoming in your conversations? So as an example, do they hesitate to reveal negotiating positions? What are the cards from China's perspective? And is there a risk that they're speaking strictly sort of the party line, as are their talking points? And then I guess the actionable question is, how do you overcome that?
Yeah, well, I guess two things. One is clearly China was and you'll notice in the book, I'm the most careful of not mentioning Chinese individuals by name. And you'll notice Indian individuals and Brazilian individuals had no problem being, I'd always check with them. I never note anybody by name without their express approval for the exact quote or point that I make. But China, especially me coming from the United States, was the most sensitive, right? I think also things have changed since I wrote this book. It'd be much more difficult now, the form of access I would have. Even when I was there, I had to sit through a 1-hour speech by a Chinese official, which was completely worthless. It was just a party line. Realized it was sort of sociologically interesting, but that was it. But others would be incredibly. I also, with one Chinese private practitioner, it turned out that I think they were probably worried that I was investigating them with respect to Tiananmen, because somehow they had just moved from Beijing to another town right after Tiananmen. And there was this tension, right? Why are you asking me these questions? What this is all about, right? There are other Chinese officials who, clearly were worried that maybe I would be a US spy, just trying to gather information. But I think having Professor Gao, who was trusted, was really important. I had, when there was a sense of development over time. Officials some of them have read what I've written before, but I think, it takes the time to build. Having good contacts is really, really important. And building a sense of trust that you're not going to, everything's confidential. Somehow you're not going to do something which is harmful to them for their personal career in particular is very, very important. Just to give some examples, I did do some follow-up during COVID of telephone calls to China. I had some still who were quite forthcoming, but others who in the past had talked to me simply found reasons not to talk with me. And imagine part of it is just an international telephone call, but also with the trade war, it's just a much more difficult geopolitical situation than it was when I did the core interviewing for the book. There's a question here. Should we go to this?
I was going to say, so we've got a few minutes left. I don't know what your timing is like, but if you have time to field these last two questions from Ranjini Ray, then that would be great. But I appreciate if you have to run as well.
Yeah, they're great questions, and it's actually really important examples for the book. So, did you look at the development of domestic trade remedy regimes and the manner in which domestic trade remedy law is practiced in India, China, and Brazil as part of your book? Yes, there's a subsection in each of the chapters on Brazil, India, and China on trade remedies. And it's actually quite fascinating because in a sense, they started from scratch. They never used trade remedies before the WTO was created. You have a whole creation of a professional bar, a very active one. We measure the number of lawyers, who are active in this particular field over time. And of course, there are many WTO trade remedy cases as well. So yes, it involves not just professional development, but institutional development. Whole new institutions, laws are changed. People come to Geneva. I interviewed the Trade Remedy Division here at the WTO. They have not only their formal meetings, but they also have informal meetings where expertise is shared. And that was quite fascinating part of the book, actually. During your interviews of the persons in the 3 countries and the lawyers you interviewed, what were their educational backgrounds? Were they primarily educated in Western universities? So this is quite fascinating. Many were. Right. So that is, in a sense, I spoke of this as a form within the theoretical limbs of transnational legal ordering. Part of transnational legal ordering involves education as well. And so in Brazil, not only were some of the key lawyers educated in the United States, but some had practiced in US law firms before they went back and created their own boutique law firms or worked in Brazil. And of course, given the amount of investment in Brazil from the US, they often had relationships with US law firms. In India, there were some ties to the US, more with the UK. But there was a sense of a more cosmopolitan group of young lawyers. In fact, I should say, now in the book it lists, for example, it addresses where they studied. So there were those who studied at Harvard, those who studied at Georgetown, and so forth. In China was later to the game, but Georgetown, well, actually, when I was a young law professor, we had Chinese judges sent over. And it was fascinating is they not just wanted to learn about civil procedure, they actually insisted that one class be on WTO law, right? This is just for regular Chinese judges. Also, Georgetown under Professor John Jackson had a major course for Chinese officials, and the Chinese government paid for them to go to Professor Jackson's course. And they refer to him as, sort of the father of the WTO and so forth. But you saw this, the impact of going abroad to study, especially in the early days. Then more recently, the government, actually right from the start, the government pumped a lot of research money into international economic law issues. About 2/3 of all Chinese research funds went into international economic law for a period of time right after the WTO. It was just an immense investment in economic, trade-related policy, trade policy-related expertise. But many of the professors, they went abroad and so forth, and then they came back to China. And it's quite interesting. So the chapter on China quotes a professor who's sort of completely going to change the way they teach and move towards the Socratic method. And they wanted to teach WTO cases because they made the students read the cases so they could understand the importance of facts in the law and not just, learning the law in an abstract manner. And they were very enthusiastic. And of course, since WTO cases are in English, and China at the time, we'll see if it's backing away now, but China at the time was really investing in English language legal skills. WTO law was a natural place for students to learn English language legal skills.
Thank you so much, Professor Shaffer. That's, I think, all we have time for. We've already we've already exploited more of your time than we had promised to do, but we hugely appreciate it. I've just seen that Aidona Ayub has joined the Zoom call. If you missed Professor Shaffer answering your questions, he did do it, so you can find it on the YouTube video. It'll be about 3/4 of the way through. So he did manage to get to your question. But thank you to everyone for joining us. And thank you again to Professor Shaffer. It's a huge shame we weren't able to do this live in Geneva. But I think this has allowed us to get an even more global audience. And there were some truly fantastic questions. So thank you so much. And everyone go and buy his book.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, everyone. And good luck with the work. It sounds like that. Fascinating questions. You're going to produce really wonderful work. So thank you.
Thank you so much.